Because we do not know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. And yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood, an afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it? Perhaps 4 or 5 times more, perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems limitless.
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, my beloved truth seekers. And why not? After all, the word heresy comes from the Greek to make a choice, although it took on the context of any individual choice that went against orthodoxy as time went on.
In light of the resurrection of God's holy prophets, we are recanting our support and declaring you a heretic.
I do like some versions of others that have been conjured on the meaning of heresy, like Robert Ingersoll, who said a heretic is, quote, the man who is ahead, or Gottal Hessing, who said a heretic is a man who sees with his own eyes. Or perhaps a more humorous one is by William Brand, who said heresy is a fellow who disagrees with you regarding something neither of you knows anything about. But regardless, heresy at its most refined and revolutionary levels is what we do at Aeon Byte every week, formerly known as Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, but forever broadcast from the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.cam.
If I asked where we were, would I regret it?
It is a perpetual sanctuary that presents you choice after choice beyond the spiritual lobotomies of literalism, in the pleromatic wavelength of the Gnostic spirit, and the rainbows in the dark that is the esoterica. Choice to find your own path into an acquaintance with the transcendent and your own transcendental self.
You and I, we have a higher calling.
And choice is more important than ever, my beloved true seekers. If we are to continue the revolution in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria to heal the world, the Tikkun Olam, or the gathering of the sparks as they call in the Kabbalah. One of the most important goals of Gnosticism is an individual sense of wholeness, a balancing of all dualities within our beings, not just with Taoist satisfaction, but for the purpose of towering these harmonized dualities beyond the physical spheres and experience that knowledge of the unknown, that feeling that is not a feeling but far more ecstatic and sublime than any human feeling able to be expressed. Like the Gospel of Thomas, saying number 22 tells us, Jesus said to them, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, when you make eyes in the place of an eye, a hand in the place of a hand, a foot in the place of a foot, an image in the place of an image, then you will enter the kingdom. Or as above, so below, said Hermes Trismegistos.
I know who I am. I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.
Sure, the mystics have warned with alarm about unity since and because the Age of Enlightenment. From Boehme to Master Eckhart, from Krishnamurti to C.G. Jung, from Anthony de Mello to Eckhart Tolle, just to name a few and varied. Humanity has become increasingly fragmented, spilling out like a bad copy of the Aeons that sprouted from the divine imagination in order to understand itself, and has fallen into a series of catastrophic bloopers like Sophia's fall, both in the micro and macro arenas.
Does man, that marvel of the universe, that glorious paradox who sent me to the stars, still make war against his brother?
And this is most obvious in the growing chasm between faith and reason. One, the hope of things unseen and often the intrinsic yearning for an astral glory. The other, the tool of discernment and the ever-sniffing curiousness of mankind.
We don't want cooperation. We want conversion. We want repentance.
Fundagelicals and radical Islamists are as Borg as ever. Yet on the other side, secular paladins of Kafkaesque courts, the rise of the atheist popes like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins have made armies of frigid solipsists.
Who knows? I may pick up a rock and it'll say underneath, made by God. The universe is full of surprises.
Don't get me wrong. I have enjoyed such books as Atheist Universe or The End of Faith, and I obviously cherish the mystical sellers of all religious traditions. But the disconnect is perhaps too much and in too many levels of society.
We can never see past the choices we don't understand.
We all probably know how in ancient times the secular and holy went hand in hand. Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato were as much mystagogues as they were intellectuals, and titans like them have thrived throughout history. Men and women who understood that the marriage of faith and reason, a duality the Gnostics would urge to pursue, was the apex of human potential.
We're all in it together, kid.
And we've more than made this case in past programs of Aeon Byte, a great example, show number 86 with Mark Booth, who spoke about the secret history of the world. Check it out. The annals of mankind have been influenced by individuals gripped by this wholeness, some that would surprise you, like Descartes and Ben Franklin, who were both Rosicrucians, Isaac Newton, a rationalist who was a Freemason and an avid fan of the occult, Thomas Aquinas, who was an alchemist and almost a magician. And the list of those people who might seem materially minded, who dabbled in the arcane or were in secret societies, are as long as Ron Jeremy's member.
You're a very bad man.
A few are Lewis Carroll, Ian Fleming, Bram Stoker, Paracelsus, Jack Parsons, you know, the guy who invented rocket fuel, Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, Einstein, and so many other giants who shaped the modality of mankind for the better by embracing both mysticism and rationalism in one way or another. The examples are endless, my beloved truth seekers, but I thought I'd give you a brief motley crew.
Talk about something important.
Are they all here? All but one.
Well, I'm going anyway. Let's talk about something important.
And today's guest makes the case that perhaps the only way humanity's fragmentation will cease before the 21st century makes the 20th century's carnage and tension seem like Legoland is through Gnosis, that divine knowledge that always adapts to the times and revolutionizes the human biorhythm.
We are not of one mind, but we now speak with one voice.
And in the arena of ideas, it mayhaps begins in the ivory towers of academia, where theologians, rabbis, and mullahs concoct their trickle-down dogma, and ends at the smallest debate forums of the internet, where small brush fires of intolerance are spreading like the shingles.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
We have the pleasure of having Jeff Kripal on this approximately Saturday, March 28, 2009. He is the author of The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on the Study of Religion, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion, Road of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom, Eroticism and Reflexivity in the Study of Mysticism, and several other books. Jeff is also the head of the Department of Religious Studies at Rice University, a down-to-earth, approachable scholar, and a truth seeker in every sense and context of the word.
And I'm here on a mission of mercy.
We will be focusing on his kingly treatise, The Serpent's Gift, which is a series of 4 very endowed essays dealing with such topics as the psychic and physical eroticism of the mystic avenues, the influence of various postmodern freethinkers and truth seekers, some which you've probably never heard of, on the way we understand the esoteric today. He also discusses the sexual and non-sexual aspects of Jesus and how we can utilize them for the understanding of our own identity in a world of evanescing gender personas. Jeff also discusses how comic books have become the new Gnostic gospels of our era and various other chakra opening topics. And yes, explicitly and implicitly, Jeff's theme is the theme of this show. Gnosticism is the bridge between faith and reason, now that it seems mysticism has been pushed aside as a past bridge.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
His book also explains that the secrets the Gnostics found in the Garden of Eden are as prevalent today as they were 2,000 years ago. After all, besides Elysian knowledge that leads to wholeness, the Gnostics believed in sprinting back to the beginning of the end, to when the tree sprouted the wrong branches, to when fragmentation because of too much curiosity separated the source from its emanations. And lastly, Jeff also urges that we just can't replicate the classic Gnostic formula, but also have to understand the contribution of mystics, occultists, and Gnostics of the modern age. We also have to understand the challenges esoteric understanding faces in this age of technology. And lastly, like Hector Avalos explained in Aeon Byte 120, the reality that the scholarly world does hold the truth about religion, and the common man has less and less idea what their own religion really means. And that is causing great problems, or should I say more Red Bull for the Mr. Smiths of manipulative fundamentalism.
I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use.
To wit, Jeff proposes and gives a formula to something we can call postmodern Gnosticism, and a mysterious concept called proto-Gnosis. And that's fine, because Gnosticism, as the great Kurt Rudolph explained, has always been syncretic, parasitical, and adaptable to the rigid fiction that is history. It is not a religion, but, as Philip K. Dick wrote, a benign virus of awakening information that breaks down the Avalonian myths of Jehovah and his angelic mafia.
How many more? Just think how many have died in your name.
It's quite a book and quite an interview, my beloved truth seekers, but so essential if the Gnostic revolution and revival are to repair not just the duality of faith and reason, but many more when you start thinking about it. If not, there will soon be red skies at night, perhaps literally, perhaps inside you and millions of others. And then the hordes of archons will continue to infect our souls and further bury our godly spark in the muck of the darkness of mere being.
There is no sanctuary.
But enough of my drivel. Jeff Kripal and what secrets he found in the mouth of the serpent of the Garden of Eden, which some Gnostics believe was either Jesus or Sophia.
This day, we rescue a world from mysticism and tyranny, and usher in a future brighter than anything we can imagine. Give thanks, man! To Leonidas and the brave 300! To victory!
This is the Aeon Byte interview. With us today, we have the pleasure of having Jeff Kripal to speak about his, what I believe, August book, The Serpent's Gift. How are you doing today, Jeff?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. Like the Gospel of Thomas saying, number 21, and the narrative of so many Gnostic scripture tells us, the Gnostics believed in returning to the beginning in order to deal with the issues of the present. The Garden of Eden was obviously one of their favorite haunting grounds. Tell us what secrets they found in the mouth of the serpent that aided them then and can perhaps aid our modern quest for the study and perhaps healing of religions.
Well, that's a big question, of course.
Sorry.
Obviously, one of the major themes of ancient Gnosticism is this notion of two gods, and the idea of returning to the Genesis story is this notion that the God that created the world and that is behind the religions is in fact a lower God, if not an actual stupid or ignorant God, and that the Godhead, which is what the Gnostics were really after on some level, was not that God. So there's some fundamental and fairly radical distinction between religion as it's practiced and as it's become orthodox and religion at its secret core or as a form of personal gnosis. So I think that's obviously one of the key claims of the Gnostics, and in the book is really not about ancient Gnosticism. It's really about the modern study of religion as a form of modern or even postmodern Gnosticism. So what I'm really about in the book is drawing analogies between the radical claims of the ancient Gnostics and a set of ideas that I would say most scholars of religion share, but may not realize bear a kind of eerie similarity to the ancient Gnostic system. And one of those is a distinction between what we might call public religion and esoteric or secret religion.
Another thing I also got from the serpent's mouth is the word, or let's say sex, but I don't think you mean exactly sex. I'm getting you're talking about Nietzsche's Dionysian energy that needs to be instilled in humanity per se.
Right, that's absolutely right. I read the biblical story on one level. The Adam and Eve story is very almost blatantly, obviously about sex. When the young couple eat the fruit, the first thing they become aware of is their genitals and the fact that they're naked. So there's something about the story that is very much about human sexuality and sexual maturation, even puberty, we could say, as a kind of falling out of childhood innocence and growing up and being kicked out of the garden of childhood and the illusion of immortality. But I'm really making a different kind of argument, because if you look at the history of mystical literature, what of course you find is sexual images and sexual metaphors and actual mystical experiences during orgasm that are sexual but are not sexual. There's some other kind of energy, there's some kind of other metaphysical realm that's being, as it were, channeled through the human experience of sexuality. So the gift, the title, the titular notion of the serpent's gift refers at once to this gnosis that frees us from worshiping this false god of public religion, but it also is the gift of a kind of eroticism that's metaphysical and sexual at the same time. And I think that's just encoded in the history of mystical literature around the world, and it's very difficult for some people to hear that, and it's very liberating for other people to hear that. It just depends on whether one's ready to receive the gift or not. Because, of course, the God of the religions is always ready to throw us out for realizing that. And again, that's what the book is about, is offering or hissing this gift that orthodoxy may not want to hear, but lots of people intuitively know on a deeper level.
Yeah, and I love that quote at the end, which can be taken many ways, in which you say, "We have sex because we die."
Right, because of course the part of the history of Christian theology is that we die because our father and mother had sex. Adam and Eve had sex, therefore original sin entered the world, therefore we die. And I think has it exactly opposite. We have sex because we die. That's how our species preserves itself, and sex is entirely natural and good, and it has a deeper level though that's essentially divinizing and metaphysical if we could only see that. And of course we can't see that until it comes on its own, as it were.
And Jeff, well, here comes another long one for you. You write about postmodern Gnosis. How would you define it? I'm getting from your writing, it is a tool of deconstruction, melting, counterculture, yet understanding of the confining systems around us, even if these systems are founded on shifting grounds after the modern age. In fact, it seems classic Gnosticism, with the aid of past mystics that you talk about in depth, is just a good fit today for theological ventures as it was 2,000 years ago. Am I way off?
No, you're not off at all. You're way on. Yeah, it's a big question, as you suggested. The book is organized around this tripartite discussion of faith, reason, and gnosis, and I rather artificially align faith with pre-modernism, and reason with modernism, and gnosis with postmodernism, although I'm very clear that I'm really not advancing what most philosophers or most intellectuals would call postmodernism. By postmodern gnosis, what I'm trying to suggest is that contemporary individuals have these sorts of experiences all the time, just like people in the 4th or 3rd century did, but that we cannot and should not try to be Gnostics the same way they were. We know things they don't know, and they no doubt knew things we don't know. So what I'm suggesting by the phrase postmodern Gnosis is that we need to be Gnostics in the context of our own forms of knowledge, and in our own ways, and that those will inevitably employ reason and rationalism, which are the hallmarks of modernism, but will have to go beyond pure reason or pure rationalism to sort of advance the ball, as it were. I don't know. Did that make any sense at all?
Yes, it did. So what I'm getting is that Gnosis itself, or the study of Gnostics, can help the individual make a bridge between faith and reason in order to really, truly understand religion, religious studies, and even the religions that are diametrically opposed today.
Right. What I do in the book is I say, again, the book is really about the modern study of religion. That's what it's really about. And I say, if you look at the field as a whole, I'm a big tent kind of guy. I don't think the study of religion should be of one school or of one type or of one system. So if you look at the whole tent, everybody under the tent, let's say there are 10,000 PhDs out there right now teaching and running churches and being journalists or whatever they're doing. On one end, let's call it the right end of the spectrum, you have the proponents of faith, the believers, who think that the study of religion should be about replicating and representing what the believer believes, and that scholars should not step out of that belief system, that they should just stick in the belief system and keep describing, keep representing, and essentially pass on the faith to the next generation. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the proponents of pure reason, the rationalists, the reductionists, who think it's all bullshit. and that what scholarship should be doing is reducing religious experiences to something that's not religious, whether that's biology or brain or economic forces or social forces or psychological trauma or whatever it is. What I'm suggesting in the Serpent's Gift is that some of the most interesting scholarship is doing neither of those things. It is not affirming the believers, but it is not reducing the religious experience to something non-religious. It's carving this really interesting middle space that is beyond belief and beyond reason. And that's what I'm calling Gnosis. So it's very much an attempt to carve out a third realm. And it's actually where I think maybe not most, but many scholars are, even though we don't have a way of talking about that.
Quoting your book, The Serpent's Gift, you talk about proto-gnosis, which is, I quote, altered states of consciousness that are important at the beginning, but are only a beginning of a movement toward more constructive, positive, and radical visions of things. And I think you are talking about how, there was a time when reason, faith, and mysticism all went hand in hand together, and this was incorporated by many great thinkers like Carl Jung, William James, Joseph Campbell. You even mentioned how Freud even studied levitation.
Telepathy, actually.
I'm sorry, telepathy. Is this what you think scholarship should get back to?
Well, when I talk about altered states as proto-Gnostic, what I mean is that what an altered state of consciousness does to the person who undergoes it is it shakes him or her up. It rattles the rational worldview or the world of faith and belief, and it opens up these dimensions of consciousness and embodiment that are often in direct conflict with the claims of faith or the claims of reason. And so they're proto-Gnostic in the sense that they propel the person outside of his or her own comfort zone, but in themselves they probably don't form a coherent worldview. The person has to come out of those altered states and then use the cognitive faculties of reason and culture and language to forge some kind of system that can make sense of them. So that's what I mean by proto-Gnostic. They might lead to a Gnostic system, but in themselves they're still relatively unformed.
What are some of the examples, because in one of your chapters, of the erotic, homoerotic, and sensual undertones that are part of the aura of Jesus in the Gospels? And why is it germane in understanding modern Christianity?
You ask big questions.
Sorry.
Yeah. The first chapter is called the Apocryphon of the Beloved. And an apocryphon was Greek for secret book, as it were. And what I try to do in that first chapter is summarize, but also synthesize a lot of contemporary scholarship on the sexualities of Jesus and of the Gospels. And I present two radically different types of Jesuses in that chapter. One, there's really three. There's the Orthodox Jesus, who of course was beyond sexuality, he didn't even have a sexual conception. His very conception was sexless, and he was raised by a virgin, well, really two virgins, Mary and Joseph, and so there's no sex anywhere there in the Orthodox Jesus. But then you have all of this scholarship that has uncovered these homoerotic patterns in the Gospels, which are quite extraordinary. There's no evidence whatsoever that Jesus was married. But he had very intimate relationships with numerous male disciples, and the Gospel of John gives him a beloved disciple who, in the Gospel, is clearly a man, not a woman. And then there's this powerful, powerful passage in Matthew on becoming eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Of course, a eunuch is a castrated male, and in the ancient world, castrated males were often passive homosexual partners. So the saying about becoming eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven is a incredibly provocative way, I think, of suggesting that there's something uniquely kingdom-like about homoeroticism. Then, of course, you have the other Jesus, which you get from the scholarship, which is more Gnostic, and that's a very heteroerotic Jesus, whose partner or wife or lover is Mary Magdalene. And there's a very rich literature as well there. The point I make in the chapter is there's no way to tell what Jesus' sexuality was in the end of the day, but that itself is a very powerful conclusion. Some of the communities came out with a sexless Jesus, others came out with a homoerotic, and still others came out with a heteroerotic. But what eventually happens in Christian history, of course, is the sexless or sublimated homoerotic Jesus becomes orthodox, and the sexual heteroerotic Jesus becomes Gnostic and therefore heretical. And so heterosexuality as a mystical practice gets demonized and becomes heretical, and sublimated homoeroticism, for men anyway, becomes orthodox. And so you have something like Roman Catholicism, which is, of course, a religion controlled by celibate men worshiping a beautiful male deity, and you can't have female priests or married priests because either option would destroy the sublimated homoerotic structure of the church. So that's my deeper argument there, is that what you see in the history of mystical literature, really almost across the board, is that a sublimated homoeroticism for men now leads to orthodoxy, and an expressed heterosexuality, expressed in mystical terms now, leads to heresy and heterodoxy.
Yeah, and you give quite a lot of evidence in this kind of ambiguity, like Jesus getting naked and washing the feet of the apostles, and
Right.
Of course the famous unknown boy in Mark who runs off right when Jesus is getting arrested. Do we really know who this little boy is?
Well, he's not a little boy, he's a young man. But no, we don't know who he is, and he runs away naked because they grab his cloak. Apparently he wasn't wearing much. And there's been a lot of speculation, of course, of what was Jesus doing in a garden at night with a man just basically wearing a loose robe. There's a lot of speculation there. But of course, in the end of the day, we don't know. Those are suggestive passages, but they don't speak in clear terms. So there's evidence for a homoerotic Jesus, there's evidence for a heteroerotic Jesus, and the orthodox asexual Jesus is what ultimately wins out. And that's why how we get eventually, modern Christianity, which is absolutely torn on these issues because it's struggling with its own demons. The churches are splitting now over homosexuality because their own Savior was single and looks, from one perspective, to be hardly straight.
Jeff, could you tell us about the man and the legacy of Ludwig, and I'm sure I'm going to say his name
Feuerbach.
Feuerbach, thank you very much. He was a very important but overlooked Christian theologian with a Gnostic gestalt. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, Ludwig Feuerbach was a German intellectual, a precursor of Marx, actually very influential on Marx, and was writing after the sort of heyday of Hegel in the German world. And he went through different stages in his career. He actually ends up pretty much of a materialist, but he starts out, I think, or so I argue, his earlier and most famous book is called The Essence of Christianity, and I give it a Gnostic reading. And Feuerbach's basic argument is that what you have to do to arrive at the truth of a theological statement is reverse it. So if orthodoxy says that man was made in the image of God, the truth, of course, is that God was made in the image of man. Or if the incarnation states that God became a man, the truth of Christianity is that man can now become a god. And so there's this kind of really interesting dialectic in which humanity can be divinized by reversing theological statements, essentially. And that's what he called the essence of Christianity, which was everything we say about God really is describing our own humanity and its immeasurable depths and potential.
So he basically was saying we have to work backwards towards God.
Right, that we have to quit, what he's most known for is what we call the projection theory. We have to realize that whatever we say about God, really we're projecting that out of ourselves and disowning it. And the secret for Feuerbach is a kind of deprojection, that we stop projecting and we recognize that our gods are projections of us, and that we ourselves are divine on some, what we would, I think today say, some unconscious level.
This sounds like some of the words of Master Eckhart.
Well, Feuerbach quoted Eckhart a lot. He really liked Eckhart. And I think there are profound resonances there through the German mystical tradition from Eckhart to Feuerbach, although I don't know how direct they are or how far we want to take them. But basically what I'm doing in that chapter is I'm not arguing that Feuerbach thought of himself as a Gnostic. That would simply be wrong. But I'm arguing that if you look at his theory of projection, it's oddly similar to a lot of statements in early Gnostic Christianity. I mean, there's actually a passage in one of the heretical Gospels about how man worships God, but it would be more appropriate for God to be worshiping man, right? I mean, that's that reversal, that's that spin.
Jeff, in one of your chapters, you write of the perils and opportunities of being a mystic influenced by the cultural backdrop of said mystic. How is the story of Ramakrishna an example of this?
Well, what I do with Ramakrishna in chapter 3 is I make this argument that the comparative method, which is sort of core or key to the study of religion, is taken for granted as something, rather boring and obvious, that you put all these religious systems on the table and you compare them and you show how they're similar and how they're different. But that actually comparison is a fairly radical process, because what you're doing by comparing different religious systems is implying that none of them actually have the truth, and that there's some deeper human truth beyond the cultural or religious surfaces. And I use Ramakrishna, this 19th century Hindu saint, as an example of somebody who used comparison as a mystical technique, as a way of essentially melting down the religions to a deeper core. And I suggest that, not that we're doing exactly that in the modern study of religion, but that there are interesting analogies there, and that there are theological and metaphysical implications that are sort of woven into the act of comparison that bear more reflection and more careful articulation.
And you believe, as you talk about the Oriental Renaissance, that's, when a lot of European 19th century scholars became enamored with the East, like Schopenhauer and so forth. Do you see this as a positive thing, or maybe somehow the Eastern faith eventually got diluted and gave us the New Age movement?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think, Orientalism, as we come to talk about it now, it clearly happened. Clearly, these Asian cultures were manipulated and misunderstood and tied to various colonial projects. But also, they function to loosen up European ethnocentrism and Christian exclusivism, and they had a very, very powerful effect on European and American culture, which I think was largely positive, extremely positive. So I think it's always a both and I think they do lead ultimately to various kinds of esoteric movements in the West and in America, including New Age religion, which I happen to think is actually far more sophisticated and profound than we generally give it credit for. I mean, there's certainly flakiness in the New Age, but there's flakiness in every religion as well. So I see the New Age as a sort of modern form of esotericism or Gnosticism that's deeply indebted to Asia. But it's not Asia. The New Age translates different forms of Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism, but it's not, as far as I can tell, it's not even trying to be Buddhist or Hindu or Taoist as you might do that in South Asia or China or Japan or something. It's a transformation. It's not a Xerox process.
And what are some of the contributions of William James? I mean, I was pretty surprised how you mentioned that the noun mysticism as we know it was coined by him or put in the right context in 1902. That's pretty shocking, huh?
Well, yeah, he didn't, of course, coin the term, but the word mysticism really kind of enters American English in a positive sense in the 1840s, 1850s, around people like Emerson and the Transcendentalists in Boston. But it has a rough go of it. Mysticism at that point has to be defended and has to be explained because it's associated with fuzziness and with women, God forbid, and a kind of out-of-control piety. It's really William James and the varieties of religious experience at the beginning of the 20th century who takes the term and elevates it intellectually into a category that then really dominates much of the 20th century discussion around comparative religion. So James is very much, I think, the father of the study of modern mysticism, although he didn't coin the term or originate it. But he's then drawing, of course, from colleagues that he was, intimate with, including Frederick Myers and the Society for Psychical Research in London. Psychical research is the whole sort of elephant in the living room here again. But I think, that all flows into James. James was an avid psychical researcher as well.
And do you think modern scholarship has lost some of that interest? I mean, a lot of modern religious studies don't even take Gnosticism that seriously.
I don't think I know. And I'm not making a wild claim here. It just is the case. Gnosticism now is very much in a kind of renaissance. I mean, it's a sexy category, and lots of very, very fine and very well-placed scholars study Gnosticism. But no one, as far as I can tell, will touch psychical research with the proverbial 10-foot pole. So some aspects are embraced by academic culture, and other aspects are expelled.
Where do we find, as J.R.S. Meats called, the fragments of a faith forgotten, or basically Gnosticism, in the comic book mythology of the X-Men and other superheroes?
Well, we find it everywhere. You're referring now to the fourth and last chapter of the book, in which I very playfully turned to the superhero comics of my adolescence and sort of reread them in the light of mystical literature and Gnostic ideas. And it's quite striking, actually, again, how there are reflection of basic Gnostic convictions like, the divinity of the person and the sort of illusory status of the social self or the religious self. So, this gets translated into Superman and Clark Kent, where, if you want to speak Gnostically now, where we all think we're Clark Kent or Miguel or Jeff or whoever we are. But in fact, we have, an alien in us from Krypton. Krypton, of course, means the secret. and it's a Superman or a super self. There's another form of consciousness that has crashed into us, as it were, and we're not who we think we are. Well, that's a Gnostic idea. Superman is a savior figure that comes from outer space to save us from our own folly. Then you can move into all kinds of other characters, from Doctor Strange to Spider-Man to the X-Men. I kind of focus on the X-Men because a lot of New Age literature actually turns to a kind of evolutionary scheme to talk about cultural evolution and about how we're mutating out of a former worldview into a new one. And I think the X-Men are it's a particularly good myth about this.
Yeah, you mentioned and how basically, as Joseph Campbell and C.G. Jung and Otto Rourke say, heroes are born with strange events in their life and anomalous features, which goes right into the heart of the modern superhero, right?
Right. I mean, the superheroes are shamans. There are gods in disguise. They're secular, but they still have all these religious functions. I mean, you don't need to watch many superhero movies or read many comics to see immediately that they function like deities, even though they're technically humans. Well, they're technically fictions, right?
Yeah, technically, yes.
But so are deities, if you want to speak in Feuerbachian terms.
Yeah, and you also talk about how, again, bringing the kind of sexual secrets of the serpent, mutant get their powers at puberty, which is sort of an initiation into another form.
Right. I mean, actually, that's a key component of the X-Men mythos, is that the mutations usually show themselves around puberty, which of course is when the sexual powers are showing themselves. So there's this real interesting link in the X-Men mythology between mutation and sexuality. And actually, if you want, I don't know if you saw any of the X-Men movies, but particularly the third one, the third X-Men The Last Stand, I mean, there's actually a scene in there where the young man who can control flame, the scene in which he tells his parents about his mutation is clearly modeled on a young gay man coming out to his parents. And of course they reject him, just like many parents would reject a young gay son. So the writers, at least of that scene, were very almost explicit in the way they linked adolescence, sexual maturation, and superpowers, which of course takes us back to the Adam and Eve story, which all of those things are evident as well there.
True,
except they get kicked out, right? I mean, they get kicked out of the garden because this petty god, does not want them to be like him. He doesn't want them to get the powers, so he kicks them out before they do. But they get their powers in the superhero comics, and then they have to live with them because it's a difficult thing to live with extraordinary powers.
You mentioned also on another level how the X-Men school of Professor Xavier basically represents the schools of academia. You guys are working on all this secret knowledge, and outside the world, well, sometimes the mundane world doesn't really care for you or like you.
Right. Yeah. And of course, that's my own idiosyncratic reading. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think we do exist in a kind of secret school, and we work with young people all the time who are questioning their worldviews and trying to make sense of themselves in this odd world we live in. And we're here to nurture their own sense of identity and their own unusual powers. And it's very much like Professor X when he was trying to do it in Westchester, as it were. But again, that's a playful analogy. I'm not, of course, being literal here. But I think the X-Men mythos, to play Feuerbach again, the X-Men mythology is about us. We are not about the X-Men mythology.
And at the same time, we do sort of now live in a comic book world where villains are literally trying to destroy the world. You know, it's not the Red Skull anymore. Now it's Osama bin Laden. I mean, these kind of what we thought two-dimensional characters are suddenly very real.
Right. That's absolutely right.
And one thing that I found very poignant in your book is you talk about your credentials, how much time you've put in the field of religion, all the talks you've given, you've written books, you have a huge bookshelf and everything. And your mentor one day, I believe a monk, simply comes out and tells you that you know more than St. Augustine or St. Jerome, and you were extremely jolted by it. Why were you jolted by it, Jeff?
Well, the context there was when I was in a Catholic seminary, 28 years ago now, and he wasn't, of course, looking at my bookshelf. My bookshelf then would have had, all of 6 books on it or something. But he was talking about scholarship and how amazing modern scholarship is, and he said something along the lines of, well, a typical PhD in religious studies would know immeasurably more about religion than Augustine or Jerome or any other patristic father. And I found that really shocking. And I was, I guess, kind of quasi-offensive at the time because I was quite pious at the time. But the more I've lived and the more I've sort of dwelt in the academy, the more obvious that is to me. I mean, of course he's right. We know infinitely more than our ancestors did. Not because we're better than they are, just because we know more. It's the nature of knowledge. It increases each generation. So, I think that puts us in a very poignant place because things that were believable in the first century simply are not believable now. Or the 6th century, or the 14th century, or even the 18th century. We simply know too much. And what I'm sort of begging for in the Serpent's Gift is simply to acknowledge what we know and to quit pretending that we don't know these things. And it's not a plea to cease being religious. It's quite the contrary. It's a plea to be religious in a way that does not have to deny what we know. It's a plea for a kind of modern Gnosticism. And so that's really why I wrote the book. How can we maintain our brains, our minds, and still be religious in the modern world? And the answer to that is not fundamentalism. The fundamentalist answer is to deny what we know and to pretend that we're going to live in this text in some kind of literal way. That's doomed from the start. Even if it works for individuals or communities for decades, it's doomed because you cannot build a healthy worldview on ignorance. So we need a different answer.
And as we spoke before the interview, and I mentioned Hector Avalos in his book, The End of Biblical Studies, he thinks biblical studies should simply not be as important, and he gives several reasons. And one of the reasons is that, number one, Christians just don't know their religion. In fact, most people don't know their own religion. And you guys are out there just doing all this research. So we have basically 2 separate worlds. And it's very hard to bridge these 2 worlds. I guess Gnosis is the answer, isn't it?
Well, it's not the answer. It's a compromise. It's a survival solution. I mean, there is an esoteric structure to knowledge in the academy. We know things that the public doesn't know, and when we try to communicate that to the public, things can go very, very badly if they don't like what we're saying. And so I think that's one of the things that drives intellectuals into the proverbial ivory tower. They're simply afraid. They know too much. I feel this very acutely just watching the news, watching CNN. I mean, the knowledge, the understanding of religion that drives world events is abysmal. It's absolutely abysmal. but that doesn't mean I want to get on CNN and tell them, what we know about the history of religions. So that dissonance, that abyss between what people say about religion on TV or on the street and what exists in the scholarship is it's overwhelming to me. And again, I'm not making a personal claim for knowledge. I'm not saying I know all these things. I'm saying the field as a whole that consists of tens of thousands of scholars and millions of books and essays, together it essentially demolishes any of these fundamentalist, literalist worldviews, wherever they're found, whether in Asia or the Middle East or in Kansas. But how to bridge that, I don't know. And I think Gnosticism, kind of secret knowledge, has been the traditional answer through the centuries. The Gnostics have hidden, they've made themselves scarce because they're essentially afraid, and for good reason, of the folks in power.
Well, maybe you just have to speak in parables. Maybe that's
that's
your only choice.
Well, look what they did to Jesus. That didn't work, did it?
No, it didn't work even when he did.
No, it didn't work at all. So I mean, that's the point. That's my point. You speak the truth, and that's what they do to you.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jeff. Well, that's about all the time we have today. Thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte, Jeff.
Well, I really appreciate it, Miguel.
And
thanks for having me.
All right, we hope to have you on soon. And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Professor Jeff Kripal on some of the secrets of the serpent whispered to Eve, both often believed to be extensions of the other, and later related to her favorite son, Seth, who spread this hermetic information to his spiritual descendants, the Gnostics. Again, Jeff Kripal is the author of The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on the Study of Religion, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion, Road of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom, Eroticism and Reflexivity in the Study of Mysticism, and several other books. Jeff is also the head of the Department of Religious Studies at Rice University. And don't worry too much about the concept of proto-Gnosis or Gnosticism in a postmodern world. Go read about the rise and fall of Phoenix in the X-Men Chronicles and think of Sophia. Let the plasmate of Gnosticism enter you like Peter in the show Heroes. And maybe it won't make sense to you, but, like all great mystics, what comes out of you will make sense to others. And you will become whole after you've realized how fragmented you've been for so long. But let me simplify what Aeon Byte, its revolution, and Gnosis itself are all about, from the words of Jordan Stratford from his book Living Gnosticism. Much better than my pathetic "We are the Gnostics" malarkey. Number 1, who we really are is eternal and immortal. We're not defined by our bodies or our gender or our horoscopes or our nationalities. Our responsibility is to be integral to this infinite core of being, in ourselves and others. The material universe is temporary and limited, but our real selves are ultimately unconstrained by it. Number 2, the system is not the world. The daily waking reality of economics and politics and bureaucracy, of cruelty and injustice, was not created by the divine, but by the forces of ignorance and greed. We don't reject rocks and trees and flowers and sex. We reject an unjust system imposed upon these things. This system forces us to feel separated from God, when the reality is that this separation is just an illusion. The system doesn't like to be understood in this way. It thinks it should be in charge, and our divinity and our humanity should take a back seat to the way of the world. In this way, the system is an adversarial to the Gnostic. We see some others worshipping the system as though it were the true God. Number 3, faith will not save us from the system. We have to first have Gnosis, enlightenment, and then understand how our own divine spark relates to the world around us. Gnosticism is an experiential, not creedal religion. You can't simply announce that you agree with a list of ideas and be safe from the illusion of our separation from God. Real salvation requires a critical, inquisitive mind and a compassionate and an accommodating heart. We need wit and sorrow and joy and silence and deep questions. Number 4, wisdom is in the world and wants to be known. The gifts of our intuition and imagination are not secondary in our efforts to remember our connection to the infinite divine. So the practices and approaches of what has generally been referred to as mysticism are at the heart of the Gnostic's journey. Dreams and fairy tales, myth and metaphor, secret and cipher, symbol and poetry comprise a language with which the Gnostic interprets the constant signal from the inbreaking divine. And I'm sure the Serpent also whispers this from the Garden of Eden, beyond time and space, if you listen carefully, my beloved true seekers. If you listen carefully. Hello and goodbye as always.
Why don't you play the tune?